Hello, everybody. You're all very welcome to join us this afternoon for a panel discussion on the subject of the North in Southern politics. My name is Caoimhe Nic Dháibhéid, and I'm a historian based at the University of Sheffield. And I'm going to be chairing this afternoon's discussion. And I'm joined by three distinguished historians of Irish politics and Irish history. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each of our contributors in turn, and then we'll move to a free-ranging panel discussion on the very broad topic of the North in Southern politics. What does it mean? Did it mean the same thing over the whole period that we're looking at? Did it change? What were the issues? What were the responses? As our conversation unfolds, people are very welcome to post questions either in the Ask a Question box or in the chat, and I will draw on these through our conversation. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Brian Hanley, who is an assistant professor in 20th century Irish history at Trinity College Dublin. Brian is a regular commentator on and participant in this decade of centenaries, but he's also the author of a substantial list of publications on 20th century Ireland, including his first book, The IRA 1926 to 36, a book called The Lost Revolution, the story of the official IRA and the Workers' Party, and his most recent monograph, The Impact of the Troubles on the Republic of Ireland, 1968 to 1979. Our second speaker is Professor Jason Knirck. Jason is Professor of History at Central Washington University, and his research focuses particularly on the politics and history of the Irish Free State. He has written a number of books on Irish politics and political culture in the 1920s, which he co-edited, and a major monograph on Cumann na Gael and Irish politics, 1922 to 1932, as well as further publications on the treaty debates, and in particular examining the role of gender in the treaty debates. And then our last speaker is Professor Donnacha Ó Beacháin, who is Professor of Politics at the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University, where he has sort of twin research interests, both in Irish studies, 20th century Irish history and foreign policy, and also in post-Soviet politics. And he also has a range of publications on these areas. His most recent monograph is From Partition to Brexit, the Irish Government and Northern Ireland, which was awarded the Brian Farrell Prize for Book of the Year by the Political Studies Association of Ireland. He is the author of Destiny of the Soldiers, Fianna Fáil, Irish Republicanism and the IRA, 1926 to 1973, and a book titled From Whence I Came, The Kennedy Legacy, Ireland and America. It's just a sample of Donnacha's extensive research in this area. Okay, so to kick us off, I wonder if I could begin with you, Brian. Could you set the scene for us a little bit in terms of how Ulster, and we probably want to specify whether you mean 9 counties, 6 counties, 4 counties seem to be on the card for a certain period, but how did Ulster figure in Irish nationalist imagination before the revolution?
Yeah, I suppose the interesting thing about it is that, it obviously does figure in Irish nationalist imagination, and nationalists universally, from the most constitutional home ruler to the most militant republican, were all opposed to the idea that any part of Ulster should be divided from the rest of Ireland. So any form of partition, which had already been mooted, obviously, was a no-no for all nationalists, really. Ultimately, there may have been nuances in what they were prepared to accept at various stages, but there was one Irish nation, and that's the way that separatists and nationalists saw it, because there were already people talking about the idea that there was obviously more than one. But despite the fact that there was only one Irish nation, it's very interesting when you look at a whole range of nationalist and republican opinion about Ulster, because they do see it as a different part of Ireland. I mean, Michael Cusack, the founder of the GAA, who actually liked Belfast, lots of people didn't like it, but he liked it as a city. But he said, we know more, as in his language, about the problems of the Red Indian and the Chinaman than we do about our own people 100 miles north. And you get again and again Southern nationalists admitting that they actually know very little about Ulster, and they do see it as a different place. And even someone like Michael Collins, who obviously had a deep interest in what was happening to nationalists, but he at the same time would say, who would go to Belfast or Lisburn or Lurgan to see the real Ireland? It's merely an inferior Lancashire. And the thing about Belfast was it wasn't really inferior. It actually was as good as, if not better, than Manchester or Leeds in industrial terms. But it's a very interesting kind of perception. People did see it as different. And I suppose the only one, and it's interesting that I was looking at the stuff you can buy in the Sinn Féin shop recently, and I saw there's badges of Father Michael O'Flanagan, who was vice president of Sinn Féin during the revolutionary period, and a really significant figure in the 1918 election and so on as well. And in 1916, O'Flanagan is the one kind of person who says, you know, actually, if you want to know somebody's nationality, you should just ask them. And the people in the north who say they're British, actually, they're not pretending. So we've got to deal with this. And he kind of says, geography has made one nation out of Ireland, but history has actually made it something else. And he kind of comes close to saying there might be more than one nation. He actually does say, you know, having the British look like they're becoming tired of trying to force us to love them. Why should we then start trying to force Antrim and Down to love us? And it's quite interesting that a Republican and a very, you know, significant separatist kind of, and he actually says it better than I'm explaining, you know, and he does say that, you know, unionism is a real thing, and there is real differences between parts of Ulster and parts of the rest of Ireland, and we've got to kind of recognise that. And I think the other thing you find, which kind of gets forgotten about now, there's two things I'll try and finish up and let everybody else in. One, of course, is that Ulster experiences the revolution differently, even in 1918. I mean, in 1968, Sean McEntee, who's a Belfast man himself, you know, talks about how in the majority of Ulster, the nationalists had let us down. West Belfast, South Down, North East Tyrone and South Armagh had cut themselves off from Republican Ireland. Now, it's interesting to see a Republican saying that the North had let them down. And he means, of course, because they voted for the Home Rule Party, which survives as an entity in much of Ulster, not in all of it. And of course, most famously in West Belfast, Joe Devlin beats De Valera. And that's significant because Republicans do resent that. And they do look for reasons why it occurred. And they do have a certain, you know, if you look at all the witness statements about the elections in 1918, when people talk about South Armagh, when people talk about campaigning, there's a real anger at the fact that they meet physical opposition from other nationalists. You know, and Tomás McCurtain talks about they're tough lads, the wee boys to the north. He's not talking about Orangemen. He's talking about Hibernians in South Armagh who fight Sinn Féin. So there is political differences between much of Ireland and nationalist Ulster, and that's not forgotten. I mean, I have to quote this. It's from October 1934. It's a Dublin weekly, and it asks, who let the North down? And it says the answer is the North let itself down. And the author goes on, self-pity, they say, is the prelude to senility. If that be so, the nationalist people of the North are well advanced in their dotage. The dreary pessimism and maudlin grief befogged the advance of a race to the tune of the North was betrayed. The North was let down. Claptrap and sentiment, the North let itself down. That is the plain unvarnished truth. And until it's realised by the people of the North, the present confused marching around in circles will continue. Now that's on Fublocht in October 1934. That's the Republican newspaper. And it goes on to say that the North voted for Home Rule. The North supported the treaty. It claims that percentage-wise more IRA men joined the Free State Army from the North than anywhere else. And again, this is arguable, but certainly a lot did. And it basically, I mean, I think it's remarkable that a Republican newspaper in 1934 would say the nationalists of the North are complaining too much because really a lot of this is their fault. So I think partition was a no-no. Nobody in nationalist Ireland was for it. People had great sympathy with nationalists, both during the pogrom period of 20 to 22, and also then obviously when Northern Ireland's established. They did see them, of course, as our separated brethren, but they did recognise as well that the North was different. And it wasn't just that there was unionists there. The nationalists were kind of different as well. And I think that has to be understood certainly in the first 20, 30 years of that state's existence.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'll bring Jason in a minute. I guess one of the things that I want us to try and tease out a little bit is, because I certainly see that there's an acceptance, as you say, Brian, people like O'Flanagan, accepting, yeah, well, maybe there is something different going on here. Maybe there are different political cultures. Maybe there are different identities. But that acceptance doesn't need to translate itself into facing the reality of what that might actually mean. Whether it's a continuing focus on London as the place to solve the problem of partition, which, you know, partition posed in a way that was irregular, to say the least. But somebody like O'Flanagan making those kinds of statements in 1918, you know, how far does he represent mainstream Sinn Féin? The other thing which occurs to me is, you know, somebody like De Valera going up and standing in Belfast against Joe Devlin, and I think Collins's seat, because he was one of those, had a dual seat as well. Was it Armagh? I think he was Armagh. To what extent is there kind of resentment at these kind of southern carpetbaggers coming in and standing against, you know, the Nationalist Party, who are much more rooted in the local political culture? Jason, how do you see? Do you see that? Does that chime correctly for you what Brian has said?
Yes, yeah, and the one of the things that the North did during the revolution was it gave Sinn Féin an opportunity to internationalize the revolution. Sinn Féin had a very obviously sophisticated propaganda arm, publicity arm, the Irish Bulletin, and so forth. And so they really thought, obviously, that they could take advantage of the so-called Wilsonian moment and take this notion of self-determination to increase the profile of the Irish Revolution abroad. And that leads to what Shannon Monahan has asked, and that is, who is the self doing the determining, right? And so there was this endless debate, like Brian had mentioned, about whether Ireland was one nation or two, that was played out in many ways for the international press as much as for internal consumption. And so Lloyd George repeatedly compared Sinn Féin to the American Confederacy. He did this largely to discredit it with particularly northern Irish Americans, north in the United States, but consistently said that Sinn Féin were secessionists, and just like the Confederacy, and also relentlessly claimed that Ireland was two nations, right? And Sinn Féin spent a lot of time attempting to refute this, and oftentimes this was through rather complicated historical analogies about their difference from, say, the Confederacy. Sinn Féin repeatedly pointed out that the American Confederacy were people of the same race as the folks they were leaving, and were people who had voluntarily joined an association, the United States or the federal system, and then left. And that made it a not good analogy with Ireland, because the Irish were a different race than the British, as it was seen at the time or discussed at the time. But then Lloyd George also repeatedly positioned Ulster and the rest of Ireland as analogous to the Boers and the British settlers in South Africa and the Quebecois and British settlers in Canada, as two nations that could be brought gradually into harmony under the sort of aegis of the British Empire. And so Sinn Féin had to spend a lot of time rebutting that also, that this was not an apt analogy, that Ulster, that at best Britain, this is Sinn Féin's version rather, was a neutral arbiter in South Africa and Canada, where it very clearly was taking the side of the North in Ireland. But also it allowed Sinn Féin to repeatedly bring up this perceived racial difference. Sinn Féin propagandists relentlessly distinguished Ireland from what they called settler colonies, like like the Britons in South Africa or Canada, which were, they believed, racially the same as the metropolis, as the mother country, in a way that Ireland was not. And so leading all the way up to the Versailles Conference, the North was used to bring this international focus on the Irish Revolution, and was used to make this whole series of analogies as to what Ireland was most like? Was it like, in essence, white settler colonies in the empire? Was it like India or Egypt or Persia? Or was it like the Civil War in the United States? And so I think one of the most interesting sort of levers here was to make this an international question. And this was all part and parcel initially of getting a hearing at Versailles, right? And after that fell apart, the discourse of internationalism changed a little bit. But that to me is one of the more interesting ways that Ulster was used in the revolution, which of course had almost nothing to do with the actualities on the ground in the North at all, right? But tied into this debate about one nation or two and settler colony or not, and those kinds of debates.
Donnacha, what do these, as somebody who works, equally on another part of the globe as well as on Ireland, how do these debates that Jason has outlined around how Ulster or the North was mobilized in terms of contemporary political arguments about self-determination, the limits of national identity, the ways in which national identity might be made to align with political identity? Do you see those as having resonances in your own area in the later part of the 20th century?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting is that, what happens in Ireland doesn't happen in isolation. I think sometimes we fail to appreciate that perhaps it's an island on the outskirts of Europe, and that this is essentially after World War I, a lot of new countries emerged, of which Ireland was one. A lot of minorities, found themselves on wrong sides of the border. A good example, for example, my wife's grandmother comes from a place called Bukovina. She was born in 1924. Bukovina was Romania. She spoke Romanian, Polish, Russian, but the Jews actually were the larger number at the time in the area. So they spoke many languages. And she found herself within a few years in Ukraine, not through any choice of moving country, but simply the boundary moved. And then because she was an ethnic Pole, after World War II was moved from Bukovina to Germany, which then became Poland. And, when you compare it to anything that would happen in Ireland, it's far more transformational and fundamentalist. And there's this notion in post-Soviet studies when the Soviet Union collapsed of a beached diaspora, where essentially you have a diaspora that hasn't moved. I mean, because when we think of the Irish diaspora or the Armenian diaspora, these are people who made a conscious decision to leave their countries. These are people who just simply find themselves more or less, the country has left them. They haven't left the country. And Northern nationalists, I think, are interesting in that perspective because they become essentially a diaspora in a way. I thought that was reinforced with the recent notion that in presidential elections, the vote should be given to people in the North and the diaspora as if they were somehow in the same general collective. So, I think that, and I think Northern nationalists became aware of that quite quickly as well, that they weren't ours in the same way. And I think that comes very clear, particularly around the time of the Boundary Commission, when they realize what's happening, they come down to Dublin looking for an audience in Dáil Éireann. And the response is more or less, look, we have obligation towards our people. And you're not our people. And you better go up there and make as well as you can out of it. But there's nothing we can do. And actually, it would set a very dangerous precedent to give you a right of audience, because people who we have direct responsibility over, not you, might be able to address us in the future. So that's what we're thinking of. So I think very early on, there's kind of this mental demarcation, which of course is accentuated by what emerges from the treaty, and of course what emerges from the Boundary Commission. But as I said, it's something that's there throughout Europe. I think what's interesting about the North is how it survived, because most of those entities that emerged from World War I didn't emerge, or rather didn't survive unscathed a century later. Northern Ireland, for all its faults, has survived against the odds, you might argue. And what usually happens in those situations is that you have a strong patron state. That's essentially what the North had, or what unionism in the North had. They had a strong patron state and a weak, the other term is often used as a parent state, if you call Ireland the parent state from which it seceded. So the South was relatively weak compared to Britain, the patron. There was that asymmetrical relationship which has been there all along. And when we look at how Irish governments over the years have tried to devise strategies about getting back the North, as it were, that's been always the huge underlying feature of it, that the powers, the resources, everything about the Irish government's position is weaker than that of the British government, and therefore it can only propose, whereas the British government is usually in the position of disposing. So but I come back to this international element, particularly the 1920s, that borders are moving, and Ireland's position, of course, is as a newly independent state, it emerges in the League of Nations. I think this is a very important point about why Ireland didn't perhaps raise partition at the League of Nations. Sometimes it's not just a matter of what you do, but what you don't do. And they made a decision quite early on, which was mirrored later with the United Nations, not to raise partition in the League of Nations for various reasons, which we can explore later. But they were quite happy being in the League of Nations, along with other newly independent states like Georgia, like Estonia. Why? Because Northern Ireland wasn't in the League of Nations, and it underlined the inferior status that Northern Ireland had as a region within the United Kingdom, whereas Ireland was a sovereign state, which of course was itself contested within what became the Republic, because anti-treatyites were of course espousing a position that the South wasn't in charge of its own affairs, and indeed that's why the Irish government at the time ratifies the treaty at the League of Nations as part of an international agreement.
So I think those kinds of broader internationalist comparative lenses are really important, and that's one of the ways in which I see the scholarship has moved very quickly in the last 5 years on understanding Ireland's revolution, not least with the project you were involved in, Brian, with at Queen's and at Edinburgh. Kind of globalizing the Irish Revolution forces us to move away from, treating Ireland as an exceptional case, sui generis, and I think that's really valuable, and looking more closely at how other minorities groups were treated, or how other minority states found their way to independence or not, or were partitioned. I think that can be equally as important as looking at other anti-colonial movements contemporaneously as well, whether it's Egypt or India slightly later, of course. I don't want to get sucked too much into the Boundary Commission, because I know there's a whole other panel on the Boundary Commission, but I wonder if we could go back a bit before the Boundary Commission and talk about the treaty. And one of the big, I suppose, tropes in how we understand the treaty and the split is that the North doesn't feature that much in the debates. So this treaty split is primarily about the oath of allegiance and the boundaries of sovereignty that was going to be granted to Saoirse Éireann, the Irish Free State. I wonder, Jason, I know you've worked in detail on the treaty debates and on that split. Do you see, does that version of the treaty debate still hold up for you, that interpretation that it's not about partition, it's about sovereignty?
I mean, if the folks who just actually studied the verbiage and how many times partition was mentioned, unquestionably it was mentioned less, and it was mostly mentioned by not deputies representing the North, but deputies from the North. But what I think it's sort of what blurs that a little bit, and I am taking here from my master's student, Katie Oman's research, so I want to give credit where credit is due, is how much Sinn Féiners really thought, even into 21, 22, 23, they could end partition. And Katie's work was on the Belfast boycott. And just to give that as an example, almost always cited as an example of the South misunderstanding the North and pushing it away. If you look at how the Belfast boycott was promoted, both during the Revolution and then by Republicans who continued it in 22, it was promoted over and over again as a way to end partition. Now, was that a realistic strategy? No, probably not. But they believed they could show the North that the South was economically needed. And they really believed that they could demonstrate the commercial ties that were essential between the North and the South. And so I think that there was, less overt dismissal of the chances of reunification than maybe, say, John Regan's argument about Southern Irish nationalism concedes. Now, that's different than us 100 years later thinking that these are workable proposition. But there was a lot of work behind the scenes. Kevin O'Higgins in particular was floating plans for plebiscites. There were a lot of attempts to use Silesia in particular, and the Silesian, the way that plebiscite was taken as a way to, if not end partition, at least take a bunch of nationalist or Catholic enclaves into the South. And so I think that, I mean, yes, I think it's true the main split is over sovereignty, but I don't think Sinn Féin leaders had quite given up on reunification in 21, 22, 23, maybe to the degree that they had in 25, which again is distinct from saying these were fantastic plans that had a real chance of succeeding, right? That's a different issue. But I do think there was a belief that it could have been somehow ameliorated or undone in the first couple of years. And I think that kind of optimism, for lack of a better word, maybe gets lost in the counting of how many times partition was raised.
Taking the Belfast boycott seriously as an act of economic war, I think that's a really interesting lens through which to approach 1921 and 22. But of course, Brian, you'll be able to speak on this in particular. The other part of the strategy, as you know, if we can identify a meaningful political strategy, is the IRA campaign in 1922-23, which again the kind of customary view of this is that it is used not entirely cynically, but as a way to kind of to reunite the divided wings of the Republican movement. This is a common cause that they can focus on and get away from the disagreements and the splits around what sovereignty might or might not mean. And this is, again, I mean, John Regan has argued this at length, that this is part of how we can understand what Collins is doing politically in the months leading up to his death. Brian, do you want to sketch for us what you see happening in the IRA campaign in the North in 1922-23?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jason's points, and also about that we can maybe come back again to the possible differences between Ireland and Europe as well. But Paddy Mulroe has done a lot of good work on this recently, and his blog is worth looking at. I mean, people forget, or they never know, or never knew in the first place, that there's a Cumann na Gael TD in Peterhead Jail in Scotland until 1926, along with 40 other pro-treaty IRA prisoners who get out because of the Boundary Commission. And they're held since 1922, which again illustrates that it is a joint IRA offensive. And I think, certainly in the minds of a section of the pro-treatyites, and this again is why a century on, because we know where these guys end up, if Eoin O'Duffy had been killed in 1922 on the border, he'd be a hero rather than, the notorious, wannabe fascist dictator. And the fact is that O'Duffy and Sean McKeown and a whole section of the pro-treaty IRA, I think, are anti-partitionists, and they do believe there's some form of a military solution. It mightn't be that they'll win, but they might make Tyrone and Fermanagh ungovernable. I mean, again, there's a big difference between the nationalists, what's going to happen to the nationalists of Belfast, and what might happen to those in South Armagh and Fermanagh and Tyrone, which are, much harder to police and protect. So I think, I mean, I go along some way with the idea that there's a degree of cynicism in trying to weaken your potential opponents, but genuinely a big section of the IRA in Ulster, and also of the IRA generally, I think, thinks that the Northern offensive is a real opportunity to weaken partition. And again, I mean, within republicanism, and this is, right up to the present day, what you're saying in public is not what you're saying to volunteers, so a lot of the people who are going pro-treaty are going on the basis, as O'Duffy says, that it's going to allow us to build up a bigger army with better equipment, and then we're going to deal with the Orange Men or deal with whoever, So I think there's an element of genuine anti-partitionism, and there is also then a way of keeping people busy, because if they look at the small print, where is this going to end up? I mean, we from a century on look at the treaty and go, well, the British say from the start this is about Ireland's place within the empire. But you look at the debates at the time, and it's people do seem to really think this is about, we're going to be independent in a few months. It's just a matter of ironing these details out in London. So, I mean, I think there's a huge amount going on. And I think the North, I mean, it was always the kind of caricature that, or the cliche that Civil War was about partition, and ultimately we said no, it wasn't really. That wasn't discussed that much, and it was about the oath or sovereignty and so on. But there's a whole series of things that do make the Civil War more likely because of what's happening in the north. The flood of refugees south is putting pressure on people to do something, and both the pro and anti-treatyites are competing to see who treats them better or to offers them, a better deal. Nationalists in border areas are really worried about what's going to happen. The boycott is kept going by the anti-treatyites, which causes trouble in Dublin, which leads to the, kidnap and counter-kidnap of Ginger O'Connell and so on by the Four Courts garrison. And then Henry Wilson is despised by nationalists as the guy who's seen as, whether it's true or not, but the guy who's behind the pogrom. And the guys who shoot him probably do it because they think they're going to help nationalists in Belfast. And that's the spark for the British demanding that the provisional government move against the anti-treatyites. So really the Civil War is tied up with the North in a whole series of ways that the rhetoric of the treaty debates mightn't indicate. Again, I'm really indebted to Paddy Mulroe and other people who are working on this, who kind of pointed it out to me. So I think the North is vital. And then the further complication, of course, is that a whole series of, people think it's an accident that Charlie Hoy's father is in the National Army. It's not. Dan McKenna, the OC in Derry, comes south and ultimately becomes Chief of Staff of the National Army. Loads from Belfast, loads from other parts of the North end up in the National Army. And that's for a whole variety of reasons, but it's still true. So trying to claim an unbreaking Republican lineage between the anti-treatyites and the Northern IRA is quite difficult in 1922-23. It does really complicate matters, and a lot of them are disappointed and disillusioned. But in the Civil War, they're not in the Republican Army. They're in the other one,
Donnacha, do you want to come in on this question, or if not, I'll move to do you have anything you want to add at this point on the treaty or the Civil War?
Not particularly, other than to say that I think, as everybody's aware, that I think Churchill in particular saw what that strategy was all about, and that's why, of course, he applies pressure on the government to kind of take on the anti-treaty forces, and then, of course, that whole strategy of uniting Republican forces against partition comes to an abrupt end, and of course that's the whole story of in many ways the early 1920s, when Irish nationalism, because it's divided both north and south, is facing more united opponents, and that obviously works to its detriment.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is that the fact that there is genuine anti-partitionism, and there are genuine attempts to bring the divided wings of the IRA together in combating a common enemy, that has consequences then in Northern Ireland as well, because the Unionist government, it's all the more urgent for them to go and arm the UVF and create the B specials and get that force up and running, and that then has a whole series of consequences, of course, for Northern nationalists, and you're into a kind of a cyclical sequence of violence that it's hard to kind of disentangle it completely. But one of the things that I think we need to do more of as historians is to maybe to connect what's happening south of the border with what's happening north of the border, and not be as partitionist as we have been in the past. And I think these were absolutely movements and governments that are, and peoples that are connected and are responding to political events and economic events and military events across that boundary as well. Moving on then into the 1920s, and after the Civil War, kind of sputters to a close, after Northern Ireland has bedded itself down completely, after the Boundary Commission, the Boundary Commission doesn't grant the territory that Southerners were expecting. I'm sure everyone knows, but not only was not as much territory proposed to be granted back to the Free State as was expected, but also parts of the Free State in East Donegal were proposed to be ceded over to Northern Ireland, and this created a political scandal, and the Boundary Commission was just part. It was never, its recommendations were never enacted. So the border was left as that county border, that original county border, 6-county border, established under the Government of Ireland Act in 1920. But thinking about how politics unfold in Ireland in the 1920s, Jason, how do you see the Cumann na Gael's government's relationship with Northern Ireland? Is there any dialogue between the Northern government and the Dublin government? Is there any dialogue between Northern nationalists, capital N nationalists, the political party? To what extent is the Cosgrave government listening to people like Joe Devlin when they are formulating their Northern policy?
They were, I mean, we already brought up the issue of when they tried to send a delegation down during the Boundary Commission debates and the Dáil wouldn't hear them, right? And I think that is more or less there was a sort of hands-off notion. And I think part of this has to do with the differences between Belfast and the rest of Ulster. If you look at the government's rhetoric, like say the Northeastern Boundary Bureau material that was brought out in 23-24, all this talk about Silesia or Schleswig or the plebiscites there was pretty much, it's a stark departure from the one nation or two rhetoric of 1919. Now they were actually talking about, can we get border territory? It was a very much more sort of quotidian and lowered expectation. And so they had, I think, already conceded that they weren't going to get reunification at that point. And so I think that made it, for the government, less interesting or less useful, I guess, maybe a better word, for them to talk with representatives of Northern nationalists in Belfast. Because the debate, even as how the government was framing the debate, was largely about getting contiguous border regions. And so there wasn't a lot of engagement or, frankly, even concern. I mean, again, O'Higgins at the negotiations for the Boundary Commission and behind the scenes is attempting to do something for Northern nationalists. Whether that's a face saver or a genuine concern is open to debate. But beyond that, there didn't seem to be a lot of interest. I guess this just happened to be something I've been looking at for a project recently, but the way the Free State government tended to see the North across most of the 20s was as like a silent referendum. It was a foil so they could demonstrate Free State religious tolerance. There was this discourse fairly often, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, that Protestants in the Free State were treated a lot better than Catholics in the North. And there was this attempt their main engagement with the North was as this kind of foil. Even in what seemed to be to us 100 years later, not very important debates about, say, whether the Irish legislature should have university representation. There was a constant parade of people who argued that, yes, they should, but we're not saying this because we're Protestant. We're not saying this because, we represent a Protestant constituency at Trinity, because we're being treated fine here. And so I think in many ways, one of the more interesting ways that they engaged was on this kind of symbolic level that was difficult to maybe sometimes talk about explicitly, but they believed made their state look tolerant.
That's really interesting, this idea that the Cosgrave government had sort of accepted that full reunification isn't possible, therefore we're just going to park it, and there's no point worrying about it. We can use it rhetorically for our own devices, perhaps for internal as well as much as external propaganda, but it's not a political project that we can make any grounds on because we're not going to achieve reunification. And that really contrasts, doesn't it, with the step-by-step attitude towards sovereignty that we see both the Cumann na Gael government and the Fianna Fáil government. So, the two big, division points of the treaty, the oath, sovereignty and unity, we see the successive Irish governments take quite a pragmatic approach, I guess, in the end, and even anti-treatyites, those who come in with Fianna Fáil, accept that pragmatism in the end, and they enact the various measures that we know about with the Statute of Westminster and the abdication crisis and all those things as a way to kind of whittle away at what were the limitations on sovereignty, but you don't see the same step-by-step approach towards partition. And I find that quite interesting. It seems to be more of a zero-sum approach. So do you have any views on what's going on there?
Yeah, well, that's a very good observation. I mean, like, and I think what both parties do in their own way is that they say that we have to achieve sovereignty first, full sovereignty first within the 26 counties before we can take on the issue of partition. And, you know, after the Boundary Commission debacle, I mean, you know, Cumann and Gael more or less stopped thinking about partition in any kind of fundamental way. And they start, as you say, kind of focusing more on getting more powers for the 26 counties. And Fianna Fáil, of course, capitalise on it. But even there's a reluctance to kind of be imaginative, perhaps, and even respond to their own grassroots, who are often more ardent in their desire, perhaps, to bring about an end to partition. So you get at successive Fianna Fáil Ardeshina throughout the 1920s, the late 1920s, moves to extend Fianna Fáil to the north organisationally. And that comes up in, and senior figures are being attacked on this issue. They're saying, look, our constitution says that membership is open to Irish people born in Ireland or resident in Ireland. Why aren't we organising in the Republic? And the standard response that they get is that wait until we get power in the 26 counties, because that's the focus, because we can really do something on partition once we get power in the 26 counties. And they send delegations up north at the time. They send up Sean Lamass and Jerry Boland, and there's not a lot revealed about the you know, they're not giving transcripts of their conversations, but they're giving summaries, and the summaries are ones that suit very much the narrative of the Fianna Fáil leadership, which is that Northern nationalists are telling us that it's better to wait because, you know, so more or less echoing back what they told, and also that it would divide. That was the other big argument the Fianna Fáil leadership were using, that it would divide Northern nationalists if they organised in Northern Ireland. There's no proof at all that it would have. If anything, as many Northern nationalists argues, would have united them. But that kind of kicks it into touch for Fianna Fáil until 1932. And that argument kind of runs out of steam, as we'll see in the 1930s, because they do have power, and yet they don't have any magic strategy to end partition. So that's kind of one example of how, I guess, you know, Fianna Fáil were presented with something that might have been anti-partitionist, but as I said, were, as you say, sovereignty became first, and then it was partition later.
I mean, I guess that's the thread that connects right from the treaty up to, well, right through our period. You know, which do you prioritise? Do you prioritise unity, or do you the unity of all of Ireland, or do you prioritise, do you maximise your sovereignty? And because they're incompatible, it seems to me, if you prioritise unity, there are implications for how far you can go on sovereignty, given the reality of Ulster Unionists. That's something that I think Irish nationalism very slowly came to recognise and to reconcile itself towards, and I see that happening, you know, slowly over the period of the 1980s and the 1990s, and whether or not we still have internalized that, or whether we're moving away from that as a society is maybe something open to question, and we can maybe come on to that a bit later. Brian, in terms of like the IRA then in the 20s, after the Civil War comes to an end, obviously the Northern IRA are in a very different, well, they're in quite a different position in Northern Ireland compared to in the Free State. They are subjected to very stringent legislation. Lots of them are in there for a long time. How are they regrouping? What's their goal for the 1920s? How do you see their strategy evolving?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do have to come back to the Unionists. It does feed into this as well. I mean, the Northern IRA were the poor relations in the 1920s and 1930s. The overwhelming strength of the IRA, which was up to maybe 20,000 members again after Fianna Fáil came to power in the early 30s, was in the Free State. So, I mean, just, you know, in 1926, there were more IRA volunteers in North Mayo than there were in Belfast. There were almost always more in the Kerry battalions and brigades than there were in Northern brigades. It's only really in 32, 33 that Belfast starts to grow again. Always far more volunteers in Dublin than in Belfast. So I mean the figures are in the Moss Toomey papers, and they're stark. I mean, the IRA is in a bad way in the north, and their own reports from prior to
what's going on there? Is it because there's Hibernians sucking off potential recruits? Is it just the IRA are down in the dumps and can't pull themselves up again? How do you explain those?
Firstly, the civil war in the south, if you can imagine this, it has this effect on the Irish diaspora as well. It really demoralises Irish Americans and demoralises the Irish in Britain, but it really demoralises Northern nationalists too. I mean, who's going to help you now when the Republican movement in the south, people who on both sides that you'd looked up to, are killing each other? Can you imagine how you'd have felt? So what the IRA finds in 1923, 24, 25, when they're trying to reorganise in the north, is that they're being told in border areas, we're waiting for the Boundary Commission. We want to see what it's going to do. And also, you're just making things worse for us. You're a menace to our peace, is one phrase that's used. And the IRA also say that they're cowed by the specials. People are terrified by the level of repression in the north, which again is a different repression to that of the Free State against Republicans, if you know what I mean. I think it actually politically it's different in the north. It's an ethnic or a religious repression in a lot of ways that affects, no matter what kind of a nationalist you are, you're afraid of the B specials. Whereas if you're not an IRA supporter, you're probably not that afraid of the Free State Army, really, because they're not going to trouble you. So I think the Civil War has a big demoralising effect. Also, the Northern IRA had lost a lot of people. It's even in terms of repression, Republicans would be deported from Northern Ireland to the south, even if they were from Belfast. So people were being arrested by the Northern government and being forced out. So it's hard to operate. On Fublocht is banned all the time. It's banned in the south sometimes, but it's banned all the time in the north. Easter commemorations are banned in the north. Now, eventually they hold illegal ones, but it takes a while. So what's interesting about the IRA in the south is that it's very driven by southern concerns. Naturally enough, they hate the Free State, and they see a lot of their aim as to overthrow the Free State. And then ultimately you'll deal with Northern Ireland, or you'll deal, with Britain. And when Fianna Fáil comes to power, the IRA thinks for a while that maybe that'll lead to a renewed conflict with Britain, and that'll open things up again. But certainly the north is you have to operate differently there. There's no honeymoon period. In 1932, after Fianna Fáil comes to power, IRA prisoners are released in the south and they're able to parade openly for a while and so on. That never happens in the north. And then what you find is that, and this isn't just the left in the IRA, it's actually the IRA more broadly. The crisis of the early 30s in the north, the economic crisis, the outdoor relief riots, railway strikes, things like this, the IRA sees an opportunity there, and they actually begin to talk very much in terms, and this might bring us back to the Republican view of unionists. I mean, the headline on Fublocht in October 1932 is Orange and Green United in Belfast. And it says, in Belfast today, the Irish Revolution has begun. And they're talking about the outdoor relief riots. A couple of months later, there's a railway strike. It's a mainly Protestant workforce. And during that strike, Sean Russell, the IRA's Quartermaster General, goes to Belfast and he writes back to Moss Toomey, the Chief of Staff in Dublin. And he says, what a situation. We have B specials searching the homes of some of our members while other specials are approaching us looking for arms and ammunition. And they supply explosives to striking railwaymen who are also B specials during that strike. Now, what's amazing about that is not that the B specials and the IRA have a connection, but how would that look to ordinary nationalists? I mean, it's kept secret because I think most Belfast nationalists would have been appalled at the idea of the IRA cooperating with B specials. So again, you still have that situation where the IRA are a minority within the nationalist community. And there's elections in 33, and maybe people can come back to them. I mean, but they stand against Joe Devlin again. They're beaten, but they do as well as De Valera did in 1918. They get an MP elected in South Armagh, Paddy McLogan. He's obviously an abstentionist, and De Valera stands and is elected as well as an abstentionist MP, as an independent nationalist, not a nationalist party. And because De Valera had, in 29, De Valera is in Armagh jail because he did travel to the north. So Fianna Fáil, I agree with Donnacha's points about this, but Fianna Fáil are still giving the impression that they're going to do something about partition. But it's for the IRA. I think they for a while the idea is this will be part of an overall Irish revolution. They're not thinking in terms of a campaign specifically targeted at the north or at partition, and I think that comes later on.
Okay, so like a second revolution that will be a social revolution, a real social revolution.
And again, that's, you know, that's associated with people like Peadar O'Donnell and George Gilmore and so on the left. But the mainstream of the IRA, people like Moss Toomey and Sean McBride and so on, they accept that for a while as well, because it seems to make sense in the context of the Great Depression, in the context of the international context they have with the Soviets and so on, and also because people are joining. You know, in the early 30s, the IRA begins to grow again, and I mean, Toomey says immigration has cut off the, you know, these young people have nowhere else to go. So actually some of them are joining the IRA. So there is that radicalization under the Cumann na Gael government in particular, that they think, yeah, social revolution is going to be part of this. And it doesn't mean they explicitly become socialists, but they do have a social and economic philosophy.
Just want to read out one comment which just come in from John Dorney. Quick comment, if I may. It's true that the majority of Northern IRA units in the Civil War supported Collins and GHQ, and many served in the National Army, but it's an oversimplification to suggest that all did. For example, Michael Carolyn of Belfast was Anti-Treaty IRA, Director of Intelligence in the Civil War. Joe McKelvey, one of the IRA prisoners who was executed in December 1922, he was Chief of Staff briefly. Many armed refugee, so-called refugee IRA, were arrested in border areas in 1922-23. I mean, I don't think anybody... No,
I think John is right.
Well, it's good to add nuance to our picture.
I think John is right, and I was probably overstressing the other, because it's what you meet all the time, the idea that, well, the Belfast IRA must have been, you know, against the treaty because it makes absolute sense. But it was more complicated. And I should say that John's book on the Civil War in Dublin, even though it's mainly about Dublin, has, you know, a very nuanced national picture, and also has a great deal of information on how the refugees impacted on the scene there too. So, I mean, I agree, absolutely. Of course, there were anti-treatyites in the north, and even among mainstream nationalists.
And John has added a comment, not a quibble.
Even among mainstream nationalists in the
north,
comment, not a quibble. Yeah. No, but it's a fair point. It's important.
When now that we're on this question of social and economic policy and what it was like, I wonder to what extent, Donnacha, you think the social policies in Northern Ireland, and in particular, you know, this is before the welfare state, but, you know, the United Kingdom has extensive welfare provisions, whether it's unemployment assistance and health insurance mechanisms that are coming into play. And one of the things that the Northern Ireland government manages to extract from the Westminster government early on in the 1920s is a sort of a commitment that those kind of social entitlements in Northern Ireland will be the same as they are in the rest of the United Kingdom, that there will be a step-by-step approach. And we know that this accelerates after 1945 and has, you know, implications for what happens to Northern society in the 60s in particular, but we can see the roots of it. It's beginning in the 1920s and in the 1930s. And is there any way in which the Dublin government that you see it are looking at what's happening in Northern Ireland in terms of that social provision? Is it shaping their own policies towards social policy, in particular, you know, the beginnings of what we might call welfarism?
Yeah, in general terms, I mean, governments in the 26 counties don't often fully factor in the impact of their policies and their legislation on how it will be perceived in Northern Ireland. They tend to, and that's of course seen in the social sphere in particular, where, you know, legislation which is a very, you know, Catholic influence, they don't really think it through how that might be perceived north of the border. But on the economic one, it's more, I think, opposition parties who tend to capitalize on that or keep an eye on it. So you get, for example, the Labour Party, you get, you know, saying things like, you know, we can't have a united Ireland until we have the same kinds of provisions as they have up north. So they're kind of, you know, but in a way, they're using a 32 county argument for a 26 county polity. They're trying to essentially use that comparison to advance the Labour Party in the 26 counties, because they're usually not organizing much north of the border. And similarly, you get, you know, parties that are kind of farmers' parties, or Clonla Talún later, similarly, you know, looking north and saying, look at what they have there. You know, we need to do something similar here, or we'll never have a united Ireland. So they're kind of cloaking a a domestic policy in 26 counties terms in the kind of the cloak of kind of 32 county patriotism. So that's where I think it largely, because there's also, I think, a naive expectation sometimes that unionists could be persuaded by an economic argument. They kind of tend to, it's all down to this loyal to the half crown rather than the crown. And so moving a little bit forward, we'll say in the 1960s, where you have, the whole Lemass O'Neill initiative and this kind of cooperation between Stormont and Dublin, it's predicated on the notion, at least rhetorically, that if you get this kind of economic cooperation, that the barriers will be broken down and it will lead inexorably to United Ireland. And yet that's never used in the opposite direction. Lemass also signed a free trade agreement with Britain in the 1960s, and Owen was arguing that was the first step back into the United Kingdom. So somehow economic cooperation or economics could be a momentum for north-south unity, but never was the logical corollary of that was never worked out when it came to east-west. But in general terms, there was a lack of appreciation, as I said at the beginning, about how policies that were enacted down south would affect unity. It wasn't really built into the equation a lot of the time.
Brian, do you see? I mean, that's kind of the big, as you point, the big context to the revival of the IRA in the 1930s is of course the social economic question. How do you see, you've mentioned the outdoor relief riots, secret, it seems, cooperation between the IRA and B specials. How and why does that disappear so much? Like, where does this great hope go to? Why does it vanish so quickly?
Well, I mean, sectarianism. The hopes of 1932 are buried in the riots of 1935. I mean, it's the cliched answer, but certainly, again, you have right, and maybe I'll just say it now. I was going to say it earlier. If you go back to the pre-revolutionary period or to the Home Rule crisis, separatists tended to have a far more rosy view of unionism and its potential to turn into republicanism than Home Rulers did. So, for example, Owen MacNeill welcomes the formation of the UVF. Pearse talks about if the Orange Man fights Britain, we'll be on the Orange Man's side. Patrick McCartan in Tyrone, the IRB, he gives his car to the UVF in Tyrone to help with the Larne gun running. And Casement says this publicly in America. A friend of mine has given his gun to his neighbours, to Protestant neighbours, or he's given his car, and he'll give it again. And in the 1918 election, McCartan stands in Armagh, and the Home Rulers say, this is a man who gave his car to the UVF. So the separatists have this idea that the loyalists are one step away from fighting Britain. And if they do fight Britain, that'll make them like us. So in the early 30s, the IRA does think that, economic reasons will force the unionists into Toomey uses a realignment along a class basis. But by 34, you've got increasing sectarian tension. You've got the rise of movements like the Ulster Protestant League. You've got, again, the fear of displacement you've got mass unemployment, and that's affecting Protestants as well. But loyalists are arguing that the Catholics are flooding into the north from the south. They're taking all the jobs. That's when you have Brookborough and Craigavon make their notorious speeches about a Protestant state and so on. So the tension is rising and rising. And in 35, it blows up in the worst riots since 1922. And the IRA are certainly active in those. But again, it's very complicated because actually the main body of the Belfast IRA was training near Dundalk in July 1935 when the riots began. But certainly, again, following that, the idea of this unity looks elusive. The left in the IRA had split away. The Republican Congress does have some success in Belfast. There is Protestant left-wingers, there is Protestant socialists involved in the movement. But more generally, I think things look pretty bleak. Now, again, when you compare North and South, certainly I think post-1945, there's a very stark comparison between the welfare state that develops in the UK and the South. But Northern Ireland's very poor in the 1930s, and Fianna Fáil outdo them in public housing. In De Valera's government builds far more public housing than Stormont does. So it's not quite clear that the argument was always met. Even the Catholics are better off economically. Well, in the 1930s, you'd be both North and South are pretty bleak, but actually the South is making some moves towards welfare provision under Fianna Fáil, and I think that's part of the reason for their success more than Republican rhetoric. It's that they economically provide for a big swathe of ordinary people in the South. So I mean, I think the economic argument is important, but the sectarian dimension, which we barely mentioned, I suppose, because everybody takes it for granted, but the North is bitterly divided, and Unionists have that fear of, De Valera coming to power is seen as Armageddon. This guy is back. He's going to be worse. The Eucharistic Congress in 1932 is again seen in the North as triumphalist Irish Catholicism, and people travelling south, they're attacked in Portadown, and they're attacked, when they come back from Dublin as well. So the sectarian atmosphere is getting worse in the 30s too, along with all the other stuff that's happening.
I mean, we've talked a lot about political elites and parliamentary groups or different kind of militant groups on both sides of the border. But what do you think, your comment about sectarianism, I suppose banal sectarianism, leads us on to this. Like, how do you think the North is viewed by Southerners who aren't IRA, who aren't, Fianna Fáil or coming away TDs, who are just ordinary voters, who perhaps don't live along border areas, who are, quite removed, I suppose, might not necessarily have many interactions across the border in Northern Ireland. How do you think they see what's happening? How do you think they see Northern Ireland? Does it matter for them in their voting preferences, in their formation of a political ideology? Can we look beyond kind of elite mentalities and get to grips with kind of what's happening on the ground? Donnacha, I'll throw that one at you.
Well, alas, we didn't have opinion polls as we do today to kind of get a sense of that. And my own research is primarily looking at what people were saying at party conferences, which I guess is a little bit different from, they weren't the political elite, but they were party activists. So they were, outliers in society, that they were politically active and mobilized in that sense. I think, Conor Cruise O'Brien once used a phrase of it being a low intensity aspiration, and he was talking about a later period, but I think you can retroactively apply it as well, that, it was only at particular points that it would raise the political temperature, but otherwise it was generally out of sight and out of mind. So like, if you take the 1920s and 30s, which we've been looking at, so for example, for certainly Fianna Fáilers, this is an event largely forgotten by history, the arrest and imprisonment of De Valera in 1929, leads to huge reaction in county councils, for example, which again would be more local level, and very, very militant statements. And a lot of that kind of, we've talked about the rosy view that sometimes Republicans and nationalists had of the Unionists, but then you see some of the very black side that they have. And there's this phrase here, Sean McEntee, who himself, of course, was from Belfast, talked about these English and Scottish settlers who weren't Irish and would only kind of become, I guess, fully part of, not even that, he was more or less saying they would only respect strength, essentially. The South had to be strong. And he was saying, let the mills grow silent in Belfast. It was almost like an updated version of the Belfast boycott of the early 20s. But it was very coercive. And it was very much, they are the other who must be subdued. And that kind of came out. And then it died away. De Valera was released and he notedly didn't stand in the 1929 election north of the border. So they were willing to use his arrest for, raising the temperature of their supporters, but at the same time, they weren't going to get more involved, as I mentioned earlier, in the day-to-day politics of the North, because that would have involved an investment of time and energies that they weren't willing to give. I mean, that was the ultimate test. They weren't willing to allow politics in the 26 counties to be left to others. They got organized at the constituency level. They organized, party branches and common. But the North, they left to themselves, and that's not for want of asking. I mean, you had delegations coming down all the time, asking for parties to organize in the North, saying it would unite people there, and even asking for for guidance about what they could do. Sometimes even asking for their salaries to be defrayed, because of course it was one thing to say, don't attend Stormont, don't participate in Stormont, but how are you going to function politically? You needed money, you needed resources, and again, they were found wanting in that respect. I know I've drifted a little bit from your original question, but as I said, it's difficult. Maybe the others can contribute more on this, because it's not something I've looked at in detail about what the ordinary citizen was thinking at the time about the North. But as I said, the general view I would take away from looking at party conferences is that it was something that was looked at only periodically, and particularly around particular issues. Another example of that would be the 1938 agreement. A lot of interest then. It was kind of almost like the Treaty Mark II, except De Valera this time was going to negotiate with the British, and a huge amount of expectations about what could be achieved. Ultimately, of course, nothing was done on partition. The ports were handed back, and into the economic war. So again, from a Northern Nationalist perspective, it was, we've been sold out again. You've got concessions for the 26 counties, but what have you got for us, despite all the petitioning that we've been making over the years?
Brian, do you have a sense of kind of ordinary opinion, ordinary popular opinion in the 30s and the 20s on the North?
I think there was, I think there's no doubt that partition had an impact, because it started to seem very far away for a lot of people in the South who didn't live in border areas and who didn't have that kind of normal interaction, which again, people in 5 or 6 counties would have had still a constant interaction with the North in a way that you wouldn't in Limerick or Cork or Waterford maybe. But I think there was a kind of an underlying basic sympathy with Northern nationalists, a belief, I think, across all supporters of every party and none, that Northern nationalists were having a bad time and that they were our people and that they were oppressed. But what you did about that, of course, was again open to question. And what you see sometimes is that in 1935, for example, when you do have the riots in Belfast, there's a wave of anti-Protestant attacks in the South on churches and on meeting halls, and actually a fairly big riot in Limerick against Protestant property and targets. And this is one way that people try and express sympathy with Northern nationalists, by attacking what they perceive as the brethren of Northern Unionists. And that's kind of, it's kind of universally condemned and dies down very quickly. But what else could you do practically except take part in a military campaign against the North? And even the IRA isn't really talking about that in the 1930s. They do, maybe by 1938, 1939. So I think a lot of the time there's a basic sympathy, which you can see expressed in the 40s when Tom Williams is executed. A lot more upset about that in the 26 counties than there is about the executions of the IRA members there. That's partly due to censorship as well, but it's also because it's different when the British do it or when the Unionists do it. And then again, obviously in 1969, 1970, when there's a wave of sympathy, So I think that there's an underlying sympathy basically, and that's not, it's not just people in Fianna Fáil, or it's not just people who are Republican. I think the basic view would be that our people had been abandoned in some ways, but I suppose Northern nationalists and Fionnuala O'Connor's book, In Search of a State, she has a great chapter on this, on what people think about the South. And those who grew up in the 30s and 40s talk about how they were aware that at election times in the South, invariably politicians would talk about the North and our separated brethren and so on, and that they would take it seriously. They would hope it was real, So there is that sense of it. It's never ignored. I think, there can be a feeling, I suppose, that after 1922, for want of a better word, the revisionists came to power and they forgot about the North and they were all two nations. There wasn't any two nations until Conor Cruise. That's a joke, by the way. But what I mean, until the 70s, really, you didn't see that generally in the South. People did claim to care. And again, I'm thinking of during the border campaign when John A. Costello is condemning the violence, he still says within the 6-county area. I mean, he wouldn't have said Northern Ireland at that point. There was a general view that until Lamass, really, until the 60s, that this was still, partition was illegitimate, our people had been wronged, but ultimately people got on with their lives,
One of the big occasions when you can have a great, symbolic, but also a kind of practical gesture that these were our people who needed help was, of course, when De Valera sent the Dundalk Fire Brigade up to assist the Belfast Fire Brigade during the Belfast Blitz during the Second World War, or the emergency. How do we see the emergency as copper fastening partition, as entrenching it further, as bringing our Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland as it was about to become farther down the road of a kind of different set of experiences, different political alignments, different quality of life, different social culture? Is this a watershed, do you think, in how the North features or doesn't feature in Southern politics? Donnacha.
Oh, very much so, and that's I think it's illustrated when you see the two Irelands emerging at the end of World War II and into the late 40s, when, as you know, the new Irish government of 1948 onwards started this anti-partition campaign, because, of course, sovereignty now has been achieved in the 26 counties, and it's seen as the right time to focus on partition. And of course, it's led by Conor Fubbocht and Sean McBride, who are trying to achieve their, pander to their own support base. But it's clear that it's absolutely the wrong time to try such a campaign, because Ireland has never been so isolated. Ireland is, at that time in the 40s, it's leaving the Commonwealth, which was, of course, considered a bridge of some sort. It was kept for many years by De Valera, as a gesture towards unionists. So that Ireland leaves the Commonwealth. It refuses to join NATO. The EEC, of course, doesn't exist at the time. And then when it does come into existence, Ireland doesn't join, and Ireland's not in the United Nations. So Ireland doesn't really have many friends and allies. It's a very lonely place in the international sphere in the 1940s. Whereas the importance of Northern Ireland to not only to the United Kingdom, but to the Western Alliance, which is emerging in the Cold War, is underlined. And there's very interesting archival material in that respect, where more or less the Americans and the British are stating that even if the North, it was a very unlikely, of course, scenario, but even if the North wanted to leave the United Kingdom, actually, in a way reinforcing what many nationalists and Republicans suspected at the time, that even if they wanted to unite with the rest of the country, that they wouldn't be allowed to, because they were so important militarily and strategically. Now, of course, the advent of nuclear weapons later meant that territorial control wasn't really that important in military bases. But in the 1940s, very much so. And that comes, another major thing, of course, that's illustrated during the war is how reticent, and you might say understandably, of course, the De Valera-led government was to accept British overtures that seemed to intimate that if the Irish government was willing to participate on Britain's side during World War II, that there might be the offer of unity after the war. Now, I think it's fair to say that Eamon de Valera's, thinking on this was very much coloured or influenced by his own experience in World War I, where he wanted to avoid, of course, the fate of John Redmond, who had been outflanked by himself, no less than others, when he kind of gave into a similar kind of offer of supporting the British and getting something in return, and that was never delivered. They delivered of course, the Irish support, but they didn't get the political offer that had been made. So I think he was conscious of that. There were, of course, many in the cabinet, particularly Frank Aiken, I believe, who thought that as well Britain was going to lose in 1940. So why would you join the losing side? But there didn't seem to be any, loss of sleep on the matter. It seemed to be quite easy to reject the offer. Though, of course, the British offer was conditional still, with some, the caveat that unionists would have to come on board in some way. For De Valera, it was too unclear. But I think many people who've looked at it have thought that that World War II and the emergency, it was the ultimate expression of Irish sovereignty and independence, and that was a separate experience from the North, of course, which for them they did participate in World War II, and that neutrality, which has become a defining aspect of Ireland's identity and foreign policy, is really honed during this period. And yeah, so I think that the two Irelands do diverge greatly, and Northern Ireland's place in the Union, I think, is arguably never stronger in the 1940s post-emergency than it has ever been before or since, maybe.
Jason, I'm going to bring you in while here.
Yeah.
I know you've been
I could hear everybody.
thrown out and come back, so I want to make the most of you while you're here.
My video
and the question
died.
is to think about. That's fine. No, the question is to what extent the emergency or the Second World War represents a sort of a copper fastening of partition. To what extent the two Irelands are set on, more than ever, are on divergent paths after 1945. Does that hold up for you as an analysis?
Yeah, I think I do agree with that. There are moments at times after that, but I think that what Brian was saying is right, that the comparison in standards of living in that aren't as stark as perhaps we like to think they are between in the 30s in particular, when Fianna Fáil is expanding social services. But yeah, I do think the Second World War is a watershed. It in terms of, I mean, even if you look at Southern Irish stereotypes of unionism, that they respond to this sort of hard-headed model, right, that we've talked about of economic incentive and all that. The creation of the welfare state post-war is, it makes it harder, I think, for the South to offer economic incentives, at least in the 40s and 50s. The 60s might have been a different moment, but yeah. So I guess in short, yes, I do. I agree with that.
And that's, I mean, Lemass spots the threat posed by the welfare state very quickly in the 1940s, doesn't he, Brian? He's aware that this represents, this is an obstacle to what can be on offer from Dublin in the event of, in the hopes of coaxing unionists towards reunification.
Yeah, but I mean, I think he also notices that it's a threat to Fianna Fáil in the South. You know, if Britain can do this, having been devastated by war, and we can't offer people, you know, when he's very concerned about militancy, growing militancy of the unions in the 40s, whole, you know, a rupture in what had been a fairly reasonable relationship between them, of which he was very much involved in. And I think that the thing about the war is that Northern Ireland has a different experience to the rest of the UK as well. I mean, Northern Ireland doesn't have conscription, which points to the fact that there's a large section of the population who the British government did not want to force these things on. Now, again, within both communities, there are stereotypes about each other's service, and nationalists would argue that proportionately unionists stayed at home to a much greater extent than certainly they did during the Great War, which would make sense because they'd been devastated during the Great War. And the one Victoria Cross winner in the Second World War from the north is a Catholic from the Falls Road, and that's not really acknowledged for a long time. So again, it has the nature of the state makes its the war, which again is presented as a moral crusade maybe a little bit later on, it's a little bit more problematic in the north. And it's problematic for Republicans too, but it's another day's work. They can discuss their attitude in 1939 on another occasion. But, you know, and people leave the South to go to work in the north because there's the economy starts to boom. The war economy leads to it. The shipyards are needed again. The textile industries are needed again. And people actually come from the Free State to get jobs in the north. So the Americans arrive and bring everything that they bring to the party for both nationalists and unionists. So it is, you know, I think it is a cutting off point. It's very significant. But Northern Ireland's war isn't the same as England, Scotland, and Wales war, or obviously the South's war either, you know. So I think that as ever, you know, the little picture on the ground might point to different things. But certainly, yeah, obviously post-war, I think British Labour is alienated by the South's neutrality. Certainly post-1945, a lot of people in the British Labour Party who might have been perceived to be sympathetic to anti-partitionism are less sympathetic because of the South's neutrality. And again, not just the neutrality, but some of the major things associated like that with the German legation and so on. It just does not work outside the 26 counties. So I think that has an impact on how Labour behave in the late 40s towards what they let the unionists get away with, essentially. Because again, the unionists aren't really for the welfare state. It's forced on them as well, but they also get little things like they get to keep property qualifications, which go in the rest of the UK. And it's property qualifications, which by the 1960s are a key element in nationalist dissatisfaction, which leads to civil rights. So I think that's important too.
Go ahead, Jason. Yeah, go ahead.
Just one thing I forgot to mention too is that to internationalize it again, the politicians in the South are slow to recognize the change that happens during the war to air power over sea power, and so they're like the attempt to say, well, we're going to stay out of NATO until partition is fixed. Ireland is not this outpost protecting sea routes from U-boats anymore in 48 or 49 in the same way that was. And so their bargaining position, it turns out the Americans in particular weren't that interested in whether Ireland was in NATO to the same degree. This sort of, they described themselves in 1919 as the, Heligoland of the Atlantic and all that kind of stuff, right? Like they were guarding a pass, and that just isn't true. in 49 or 50. And so the bargaining position to end partition sort of internationally has gone away also. And I think the politicians in the South are slow to recognize that change, geopolitical change.
I mean, I think it was Donnacha, was you had this point originally, like the extent to which Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, as it becomes, is isolated in the 40s and 50s is immense, and maybe that explains the enthusiasm with which Dublin governments finally, when it did come to embracing Europe, did embrace Europe in the end, because Ireland is very much out in the wilderness in the 1940s and in the 1950s, and not just in terms of what's happening in terms of emerging European cooperation, but also getting cold shoulders from America, not having access in the way that they would have hoped, being, you know, on the sidelines and not being able to use, as you say, Jason, the leverage. We hoped to get up to the end of the war. We have gotten up to the end of the war. One thing which, Brian, you mentioned in some of our kind of pre-session discussions was that you wanted to maybe get to what was not said about Ulster in Irish nationalist discourse. Can I ask you, what do you mean by that? What do you think is enough or not said openly enough?
Well, I think actually Donnacha mentioned some of it when he talked about some of the reactions in 1929 to Dev being arrested, and the kind of polar opposite of the separatist optimist view, which is that the Unionists are Irish Republicans just waiting for the shutters to drop. The opposite of that is really a view that is expressed by Martin Corrie of Fianna Fáil occasionally in the Dáil, but very few others, and I wouldn't hold him up as an exemplar of good kind of thinking. But it's interesting. I think what he says is a view held by more people than him, but is generally unsaid. And he says in 1936, in a debate about partition, that he says, I should point out, in a debate on partition, we should consider what kind of people we're inviting in. I have a very clear and honest idea on the whole issue. I do not know that I'm very anxious to bring some of these people in here at all. I'm anxious to hold the 32 counties, but I should like to hold them without some of the fellows that are in the north. Now, he also later suggests using poison gas in a campaign to end partition. He doesn't explain how that would be, you know, how exactly that would work, thankfully. But the point is that Corrie is basically saying something that is unsaid, but which I hear all the time, which is that if the Unionists are British, they should go to Britain. And given that we have moved from this kind of being an abstract discussion into quite potentially being something that's going to be a reality in the next decades at least, we should discuss what do we mean about unionism, about republicanism, about what a united Ireland, what kind of shape it would have. And there is, you know, a view which it does emerge during the revolutionary period as well, and in journals like Old Ireland and so on, edited by PJ Little, they debate, you know, this idea of Ulster and the people who live there, and are they basically Irish or are they not, or are they settlers and so on. And of course, if you're a settler, you are somebody who can pack up and go back essentially. So you have that idea. Now, that is, it's not a nice thing to discuss, but it's a reality within nationalist discourse that tends to be whispered rather than shouted. I mean, Corrie did everybody the service of actually saying it out loud. And of course, most people will go, no, we don't mean that at all. They're our brothers and sisters and we've just got to convince them. But it is a reality of this whole century of partition, about what exactly do you mean? And there's people who think, well, there were Unionists in the South as well. And as soon as, you know, the South became the Free State, they just packed in. Well, they packed it in because they were a small minority. A united, you know, what would a 32 county Free State have looked like? I always think that's an interesting question. You know, if their sovereignty, limited sovereignty, had been given to the entire island, because that would have been a very different place with more than 1 million Unionists, you know, and the whole thing about symbolism and so on. I mean, people ridicule the idea of the Unionists caring about the flag at City Hall. Well, we kind of care about the tricolour. You know, if someone suggests we shouldn't fly that, I think people would be upset, you know. So I think the idea, all these things need to be teased out a little more, and I don't have the answers to them, but I do know that people don't say out loud all the time, you know, what they mean about them.
I agree. Donnacha, you're wanting to come in there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really important point. And this dichotomy has been there all along. Are these long lost brothers and sisters who are United Ireland or Wolf people waiting to get out, or are they victims of false consciousness? Are they pawns? Are they proxies? Or are they worse? Are they, you know, but, and sometimes these exist in the same person over time. I mean, like if you look at the statements of people like Sean McEntee in particular, or Sean T. O'Kelly, they can go either way on this over the decades, and it hasn't been resolved. And I've seen it in countries similar to Ireland, having lived in places like Georgia and being in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and whatnot. This similar dichotomy of kind of territory versus people. Are we talking about a united Ireland in terms of territory? Are we talking about it in terms of people? Who are the people, and if they are different, how will they be accommodated? And it's not resolved in those countries either. So again, it's not something uniquely Irish, this view, and it's but it's interesting to note that like even De Valera in his most pessimistic moments would be talking privately to people like John Maffei, the British representative in the 30s and 40s, and he would be saying things like, maybe we could go for population swaps. Maybe we could get Irish people in Britain to come back. I don't know how that would be engineered, but they would come back, and we could just move those who want to be British from Northern Ireland to Britain. I mean, that actually is put out there in private conversations by De Valera. So it does reveal that at some moments it's like, no, they're irreconcilable. We don't want them. And then yet publicly it will be a very different outlook, that these are people who are ultimately ours and who have just lost their way and have to come back to the fold. And yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating dichotomy in a way, but as I said, it's not uniquely Irish either.
Can I?
Yeah, Jason, please.
The question of what's unsaid gets at the difficulty of folks, politicians or ordinary folks, say 190, 80 years ago, talking about imperialism within the British Isles. They don't necessarily know what kind of language they want to use. There's a Boundary Commission document in 1923 that says the people in the North aren't Anglo-Saxon at all. They're just Pictish and Celt like we are, right? I mean, and so arguing about Pictish origins probably isn't a political winner in the 1920s in terms of efficacy, right? But I mean, there's this desire at times to talk about these folks as essentially in some way Scottish, right? But it also suited Sinn Féin's overall kind of anti-imperialist message to see them as British in that context, or the message of people like Countess Markovits, right? To see them as spearheads of not just British imperialism, but British capitalism, right? And so there was, it got into this tangle with Sinn Féin anti-imperialism, sort of internal, or colonialism internal to the British Isles, and this occasional desire to talk about a shared Celtic heritage amongst imperialized peoples in the British Isles. And that was a tangle that, yeah, McEntee, O'Kelly, all those folks had a difficult time disentangling or unentangling, I guess. Untangling.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, I think you're right, Brian. And there's been some interesting, I saw a recent blog by Pollock, who was trying to kind of hammer down, okay, what actually is, if we are going to start talking in a serious way about Irish unity, what is this actually going to mean in a concrete fashion for unionists who we're trying to persuade to vote for Irish unity? If you know, these are the ones who are being wooed, who are being courted, as it were. And I know there's been of public events and kind of political meetings, cross-party political meetings in the Republic of Ireland, where you have a range of speakers, you know, trying to tease that out a little bit. But I mean, my own view is that treating Northern Unionists as either, you know, deluded Irish people who just don't realise that they're Irish people, and one day they're going to wake up and throw off their false consciousness, or viewing them as settlers. I don't think either of those are feasible kind of political frameworks with which a united Ireland might possibly emerge. I've been reading some of the poems of John Hewitt recently, who grappled with that question of, you know, I come from planter stock, I've lived here for 300 years, you know, naming out, you know, he's part of this wave of Ulster regionalist poets that eventually led to the emergence of people like Seamus Heaney. But some of his poems kind of grapple with that with that question of identity and where does identity come from, and am I Irish, but am I also do I have an Ulster identity as well, and what does that mean? And you see through his collected poems how that changes over time as violence in Northern Ireland becomes more and more intense. In the 1960s, he kind of revisits some of his poems and adds bitter postscripts to some of them, where previously he'd been kind of listing off all the beautiful names of the townlands in County Antrim and County Tyrone. There's a bitter postscript where he notes that these names mean atrocities, they mean bombs, and that's part of how he is struggling to deal with what violence in Northern Ireland means. This has been a really kind of wide-ranging discussion. I think one of the interesting things that has come out of it for me is that, in the same way that we didn't talk about this directly, but it's well understood that Northern Unionist governments used republicanism in the South, used the rise of De Valera, used the rise to power of Fianna Fáil as electoral strategies for themselves. We can't have any kind of disunity, any division within the Unionist electoral bloc. Don't vote for any of these dangerous independent Unionists, because we need to preserve our essential political unity because there's this great threat over the border. And that's part of how they eventually, take the legs out from under socialist or liberal Unionists in the 1930s. But just as that's happening in the North, it's happening in the South as well, right? The North is this the Black North is this mysterious foil against which all sorts of things can be projected, against which all sorts of domestic political strategies can be articulated, as Donnacha said, using a kind of a cloak of anti-partitionist or of all Ireland politics. It can actually be about very basic domestic political agendas, and that's so. We North and South kind of serves a purpose for the opposite jurisdiction through the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So we probably could keep talking, but I'm conscious that it's a Friday afternoon. People probably need to go and light the fire. Jason needs to go and have some breakfast. I'd like to thank all of the audience for coming and listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'd also like to thank our three speakers, Donnacha Ó Beacháin, Brian Hanley, and Jason Knirck. And this has been part of the Louth County Council Decade of Centenaries. And so we are also grateful to Tommy and to the organisers. So thanks everybody, and have a good rest of the weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Caoimhe.